So, good morning and good afternoon, as Rosemary already said to everybody. It depends on the time zone you're finding yourselves. I'm really glad to be here with you today and to welcome all of you in this seminar. I have the pleasure to moderate. I'm Eleni Porfiriou. Of course, you have to know who I am, otherwise, why you have to accept my being a moderate. So I'm an urban historian and with a PhD at the UCL London and working on Camillo Sitte since my PhD. As an urban historian and urban conservation expert, I have been working since the late 90s in the Italian National Research Council, and I coordinate this genealogy of urban design, good design network, in the context of which exactly this seminar is going to take place. So what about what we mean by this genealogy of urban design? Just a few words before introducing the seminar itself. It's a network interested in the genealogies of urban design since the industrialization period, that is 19th century. It is created almost a year and a half ago, and it aims mainly on three aspects. One is to enhance historical research in the urban design field. The second is to enlarge urban design canon worldwide. And the third is to strengthen the links between theory and practice, in other words, between historical research, university teaching, and contemporary practice. If you want to have a better understanding of what urban design, genealogy, good design network is about, you can look at the website, or you can, website of the Good Design Network is www.GUDesign.org, or otherwise you can immediately join the network and contribute with your work. It is exactly, as I said, in the context of this genealogy of urban design network, that the thematic node coordinated by David Grahame Shane on contextualism, collage city, and beyond fits very well, and this to the aims of this network, as immediately heard. Today's first seminar of the node inaugurates a timely revisitation of contextualism and collage city. It's timely, and it is a revisitation in three different senses: a genealogical perspective that is regarding the past and the historical approach. It is a revisitation in its relationship to the present regarding practice, and in this sense, as practicing what we preach, as Blake Middleton have entitled his first version of his presentation of today. And thirdly, it is a revisitation in reference to the new tools of representation available in the contemporary digital meta-city. Partially only will be treated in this seminar, but probably future seminars will take a leap forward on this direction. I'm therefore very pleased and really honored to, as coordinator of the Good Design Network, to moderate today's seminar. And I prefer right now to leave you immediately to the presentations. So I would like to invite Michael Schwarting to present his, to give his lecture. Michael is an architect, urban designer, and professor of architecture. He received a Rome Prize Fellowship from the American Academy in Rome, graduated at Cornell University, and he has been director of the graduate program in urban design in New York Institute of Technology. He's author of the book entitled Rome, Urban Formation and Transformation, on which actually his talk of today will be dedicated. He presently leads Campania's Schwarting Architects and had served on the board of the Architectural League of New York City and Van Allen Institute. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to make this presentation. I think I'll start right away by hopefully sharing the screen. I need to get. Sorry, I'm having some trouble getting the. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. I'm presenting a book that I've written. I was asked to do that, and I worked on this book since I was in Rome at the American Academy in Rome, and after being at Cornell in the urban design program with Colin Rowe. From these experiences, I've developed some theory of potential processes of designing the city, and I am deeply indebted to Colin for this. When I studied architectural history, or when most all of us studied architectural history, buildings were presented mostly by German historians in pure isolation and not in context. When I went to Rome, it was the opposite, a very different story. Urban buildings made more sense because of their relationship to their context. The book is about this concept of contextualism. Also an important issue of the book is a discussion about what I learned, what I term ideal thinking and real making. Plato discusses the ideal and its relationship to things which are imperfect examples of it. Ideal is about perfection, existing in the imagination and not likely to become reality. The dialectical opposite of ideal is the real existing as things not imagined. Reality is what exists and is understood through sensation, reflection, not imagined or supposed. Real knowledge is gained through and guided by experience. In relationship to the ideal as something imagined, we also have the concept of a utopia, which is defined as, and I quote, an imagined place or state of things where everything is perfect. It employs the imaginary to project the ideal, a perfect social, legal, and political system or place, state, or condition. In contrast to the ideal, a utopia can enter into the realm of the physical, of architecture or the urban. A utopian proposition is thus quite different from an ideal notion in a significant way. It is an imagined reality. In 1959, Rowe published an article, The Architecture of Utopia. And in Collage City of 1979, his first chapter is Utopia, Decline and Fall. In 1959, he stated, architecture serves practical ends. It is subjected to use, but it is also shaped by ideas and fantasies. Its rationale is cosmic and metaphysical, and here, of course, lay its particular ability to impose itself on the mind. My proposition is that the Renaissance architects were involved inventing ideal cities, utopias, but working in the existing medieval city. They worked with the dialectic of developing the ideal city, the ideal piazza, church, and palazzo on the one hand, and instead of tearing down the medieval city or building new ones elsewhere on open land, as I'll come back to in the end of my lecture, they sought ways to transform the existing city by insinuating the ideal, the new city, into it. As Spiro Kostov put it, ideal schemes for perfection overall form stayed in treatises. Reality forced a respect for built things, as long as they were serviceable, as long as they could be kept standing. Urban stock was not casually expendable, so the new style had to rely on exemplary accent to make its point. This is a lesson for working in the contemporary existing city, I believe. In the Renaissance, practice grew out of critical theory. The interest in antiquity, in Plato and Vitruvius, and their particular descriptions of the ideal city led many architects to describe or draw ideal schemes. Verbal descriptions by Alberti and Filaretti discuss or imply the society that was to inhabit these cities. Sforzinda, Fragicando's image, Francesco de Giorgio Scamazzi, and many more worked with this ideal city. And street scenes by Peruzzi, Cerilio, Piero della Francesca created a theoretical body of proposals that reflected a new conception of order and space. So some images to reference in relationship. Here's a few paintings which suggest the ideal piazza, the ideal church, the ideal palazzo, and the possibility that the ideal can be realized in this utopian manner. This is a diagram of Rome that I've made. There's a Bufalini map in the lower left. The diagram is a selection of connections that were made in the Renaissance to try to reference, I believe, the ideal city and place it, insert it in some way into the medieval Roman city. This was a real challenge because St. Peter's, which should be in the center of an ideal city, is across the Tiber and in the upper left. And the political center, the Campidoglio, is way down at the bottom of this diagram. Those two should be in some hierarchical relationship to the ideal city. So what I would like to suggest is that with the Sforzinda on the left, that the diagram on the right is an ideal city that, as I often say, someone sat on, or it was contextualized into the existing conditions. And my book has a series of case studies to try to argue this point, argue this diagram. And it involves the contextual architectural elements, along with the adaptation of, I would say, ideal spaces into a sequence that references in the mind the ideal city, and to some degree in experience. So the book case studies, this is the typical format, and I'm not going to discuss it that much, except that it involves the figure ground drawing, which I think we're going to hear about next. Typically Giuseppe Vazzi images that shows good, I think, contextual relationships of Renaissance buildings. A series of diagrams in the center that try to go from the ideal to the real, transformation diagrams. And then on the right, some sort of architectural spatial analysis with the urban context. And the other part of the book, and these are not in the same format as the book, but are fairly accurate drawings made by my students over a number of years at Columbia University, summers in Rome. So the plans are fairly normal, typical, we've seen them. The three-dimensional drawings are more contextual than usual, but sort of most importantly, I think, are the sections that put the buildings into different contextual relationships. So the two issues that I start with, the St. Peter's and the issue of, I would say, in the transformational diagrams, dragging St. Peter's through the work of Bernini's Piazza down to the Castello San Angelo, across the Tiber, where the spaces flow into the medieval fabric of the Campo Marzio. The other end of the issue is the Campidoglio and a complex set of building spatial relationships that also reference in, I think, important ways, St. Peter's in one direction and ancient Rome in the other direction. And again, the sections that mostly involve topography in the case of the Campidoglio. The other part of this diagram in the Campo Marzio is this concentric ring that you can see on the right that is structured in the Renaissance, not planned as one whole, but a set of relationships of palazzi and piazzas that create a circular relationship from Tiber back to Tiber to the Piazza di Ponte, Castello San Angelo, and St. Peter's, therefore trying to reinforce the idea of St. Peter's being central to the city of Rome. And these follow the same format, the figure ground, the vasi, and other, sometimes my photographs, and the transformational diagrams down the center from ideal to contextualized or real. Again, the student drawings and the importance of the sections. The Cancelleria, one of my favorite buildings, and always the question of why is the door where it is, and it can only, I think, be explained by its relationship to the Campo di Fiori and the Farnese that I just showed, and this ring that connects the Tiber to the Tiber and references St. Peter's. And finally, the last one of this ring I show is the Piazza Navona that was discovered when Mussolini was going to tear it down. This transformation of space from different uses and a complicated space with the Palazzo Doria Pamphili, the Bernini's contribution of the fountain, Borromini's church, etc. An ensemble that still has, I believe, a relationship to the kind of ideal notion of palazzo, piazza, and church. So the second part of the explanation of the transformation or the contextualizing of an ideal city is the next generation of projects that were made in Rome, going onto the hills through popes before and mostly including Sixtus V, to create a pilgrimage route to churches that existed in the Middle Ages but were outside the city, and to try to incorporate them into the Campo Marzio area. And so there is in this upper diagram, also the lower one, in the top, the Piazza del Popolo and the church, Maria del Popolo, and then the Santa Trinita and the Spanish Steps, slightly down. I don't know if my pointer is helping with this. And then down the hill and up the hill to the Quattro Fontana, but continuing over the hills of Rome to Santa Maria Maggiore, San Giovanni in Laterano at the bottom left, and Santa Croce in Gerusalemme. In any case, these were set up as what we often call urban nodes that have a church, a piazza, and thanks to Sixtus V, and also to, I suppose, Mark Antony, obelisks. And this goes through the same sequence. And just for a fleeting glimpse, Santa Maria del Popolo, the student drawings, the beautiful sections, in some cases, a sort of historical transformation also from the Domenico Fontana piazza, which worked well with the church, to the final piazza of Valadier that connects the Pincio Hill over to the river, sort of secularizes the space. The Spanish Steps, which were a negotiation of a hill, again, contextualizing a desire to make a straight streets connecting nodes, but shifting across a hill. The beautiful sections of my students. Santa Maria Maggiore, which is in the way of the street, it faced away from the city. So the architectural project was to make a back into a front in its contextualization, connecting it to the center of the city. And finally, San Giovanni in Laterano on the southern wall of the ancient city, and its side was facing the center, so the piazza is now related to the transept with its obelisk, and the front goes over to Santa Croce in Jerusalem. So, and its drawings. So that's my sort of discussion about contextualism, using Rome as a kind of case study. The issue of the topic today of beyond, I'd like to talk about a little bit. If one interprets ideal proposals as diagrams, which are not intended to be built, but are rather, as Rowe states, to instruct, civilize, and edify the normal growth, change, and transformation processes of cities, then the effects of these proposals can be a new city growing from the old. This is important for considering urbanism today. These examples of Rome demonstrate an approach to remaking the city that is very different from the ideas and theories that have been proposed in the 18th to 21st century urbanism. The approach advocated by members of CIAM that was strongly influenced by Le Corbusier, as evidenced in the 1922 Voisin Plan of Paris on the left, was to plant a new city project in the existing city. This implied eventual replacement of the historical city with the new city. These ideas were made in the clearance and redevelopment projects of the US Federal Urban Renewal Program that had deleterious effects on many American cities, that's in the center, this form of planning has continued in the deconstructivist theory of the 80s and the 90s and continues today. On the other hand, in the 18th century, theory of the Garden City by Ebenezer Howard, there was a proposal to replace the existing city in new sites with plans claiming to resolve the problems of the historical city. This followed with the Newtown movement that continues today in areas such as the early new urbanism, and have continued essentially implying abandoning the city. So I would argue that the tendencies that pervaded in the 19th, 20th century were to replace the city or abandon the city. But there's been a third alternative view of urbanism that is exemplified by a significant history of sympathetically adding into the existing city by understanding its underlying structure and insinuating or even imposing sympathetic insertion, modification, extension, and growth. The Renaissance and Baroque city insinuated and to various degrees sympathetically imposed utopian ideas into the existing city in such a way as to maintain the life and character of the existing while creating a new image and structure and thus new meaning. Rowe proposed an investigation of how the modern city might be reconciled with the traditional city, achieving a sympathetic yet changed city. In the early studio at Cornell, the lessons of Rome so drawn here exhibit both a way of thinking and a range of strategies by which a more contextual architecture and urbanism might be accomplished without being limited to a historical replication or a stark contrast with it. This is the objective of the Colin Rose Cornell School of Contextualism, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I hope you can hear me better than now. I hope, at least. Is it getting better? Just a sign? Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you very much. Considering that the discussion will be at the end of all kind of presentations, I'm going ahead by introducing the next two presenters. You can hear or not? Yes. Okay. Okay. So it's Esin Kömez Daglioglu. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Esin is assistant professor at Middle East Technical University of Ankara in Turkey. She completed her PhD in 2017 at Technical University of Delft where she also taught design and theory courses at the chair of architectural composition and public building. Her research has been published in several books, including Site Matters, Strategies for Uncertainty Through Planning and Design, New Urban Configurations, and Architectural Contextualism. With her Cansu tour, she's graduated at the TED University in 2018, received her master's degree from the University of METU in 2021 with a thesis titled Making of the City, Uncovering the Plan Game, supervised exactly by Professor Esin Kömez. So the two of them, actually the research focus of Dr. Tur is in the interaction between architecture and urban design, representation techniques and industrial heritage sites. And on these issues, she's currently working on the Culture Department of Turkey's National Commission for UNESCO as a sector expert. So I'll give the floor to both Esin and Cansu, and thank you.
Thank you, Eleni. First, I'm very excited and honored to present our work alongside Colin Rowe students and colleagues. Colin Rowe was a very central figure in my PhD studies, which I completed at TU Delft, and our interest continued here at METU together with my graduate student, Cansu Turk. So I hope I'm sure these topics are very familiar to you, but I hope you still enjoy our presentation. Figure ground maps are among the most conventional tools of urban design pedagogies and practices worldwide. Architectural theorist and educator Colin Rowe's urban design studio at Cornell, which he initiated in 1963 and taught until the end of the 1980s, was a milestone in developing and disseminating the use of figure ground maps as a source of reference for architectural and urban composition. Rowe's Cornell Urban Design Studio was one of the rare studios in the field of architecture, and the results have been published, exhibited, and disseminated extensively in international platforms. Although the students of the studio wrote much about its pedagogical model, here you see a couple of the examples, no publication has explained it better than Rowe did at a faculty meeting held in winter 1963-64. As shown in a manuscript from the Cornell University archives, members of the College of Architecture, Department of Design of Cornell University came together to discuss the teaching of design in new architectural curriculum. In his speech, Rowe defined the aims of an academy to be as follows, quote, to equip the students with skills necessary for the practice of his profession, and two, to enable him to develop his powers of selection by the process of his own judgment, and to develop and ultimately teach the science of architecture. Here I mean science as Alberti or Palladio used the term, unquote. So Rowe argued for the development of the science of architecture by preparing a dictionary containing a vocabulary of hypotheses that could be used for the ignition of the design engine. In other words, he believed that a design process cannot begin only as a result of intuition, creative furore, or accident, nor biological process, fact-finding, or problem-solving behavior. He argued, rather, that the vocabulary of past forms can work like hypotheses in igniting the design engine, and he expressed this later in Collage, quote, the role of traditions in society is roughly equivalent to that of hypothesis in science, unquote, by referring to Karl Popper's writings on the development of scientific knowledge. In this regard, tradition is understood as past forms that are made relevant today through visual studies cultivated by historical knowledge, which Rowe's instructor Whitcover exemplifies here on the left, and Rowe himself showed in his master thesis on the theoretical drawings of Inigo Jones, as well as in his first publications, such as the Mathematics of the Ideal Villa. Not believing in the relevance of programmatic studies to ignite the design process, Rowe seldom provided briefs in his design studio, as was reported by his students. This argument is most explicit in the article Program versus Paradigm, delivered as a lecture by Rowe in 1980 and later published in the third issue of the Cornell Journal of Architecture. In the article, Rowe defined the emphasis on empirical context through data addiction as the worship of program, and excessive typological concern as the worship of paradigm, the first exemplifying the false empiricism of modernist architecture, and the latter the false idealism of Italian neo-rationalism. Rather than glorifying one over the other, Rowe was searching for a dialectical solution that could operate between type and context. So here where the figure ground drawings comes in. In Rowe's urban architectural theory, figure ground maps were used first as a tool to study the volume and space characteristics of traditional and modernist cities. In comparing them through the relation of solids and voids, Rowe showed how the modernist city is composed of freestanding objects on vast open ground, so-called the city in the park, while the traditional city is characterized by defined voids shaped by the built mass. In this regard, Nolli's Nuova Pianta di Roma, which depicted civic and religious structures white as successive urban spaces, while rendering housing and commercial structures black as an urban pushy, was taken as a model for design. Hence, instead of Pranesi's Campo Marzio, where the city was depicted as the sum of architectural fragments, Nolli's map of the 18th century Rome was favored, since Rowe defined architecture not as the design of single artifacts, but rather an urban pushy that has the potential to define and create the civic spaces of democratic societies. Thus, opposing modernist urbanism approach of taking the site as a tabula rasa, a blank sheet, Rowe focused on the urban tissue of traditional cities, specifically on the formal texture of cities, which can best be depicted in figure ground plans. This points to an original meaning of contextualism, meaning weaving together, which in the figure ground maps of traditional cities refers to the intertwined relation of solids and voids. In this regard, it was argued that the contextual approach created a well-balanced urban fabric of solids and voids, which could be achieved by designing buildings as composite forms. These composite forms are achieved by pulling apart ideal types and rearranging them using a collage technique like a bricoleur. This makes not only the form, but also the time composite, referring to a synchronic rather than diachronic understanding of time. In other words, elements of the past and present can simultaneously be present today, which denotes time as composite rather than linearly progressive. Therefore, Rowe attained the science of architecture with ideal types as hypothesis tested in relation to context, which was understood as urban texture mapped through the black and white figure ground drawings. Wynne-Cooper's project, completed in 1967, introduced figure ground drawings to the studio that, according to Rowe, quote, had a tremendous impact on subsequent student projects, unquote. And his figure ground drawing of Wiesbaden would be later used as the cover of Collage City. Almost 30 years after the project, in his book, As I Was Saying, Volume 3, Rowe criticized the use of figure ground plans as design strategies, stating that, quote, now the figure ground technique will lend itself to the description of cities mostly on flat sites and mostly with a ceiling of about 5 stories, and apart from that, it doesn't work, unquote. In fact, the plan game that Rowe discovered in the 1950s can operate as a more versatile tool for urban design pedagogy when compared to the figure ground maps. Although the traces of the plan game can be found in Colin Rowe's Collage book, to our knowledge, he couldn't use this plan game as a pedagogical tool in his Cornell studio. So we will be sharing your experiences or knowledge on the topic afterwards. Rowe taught at the University of Texas at Austin between 1953 and 1956, together with, among others, Bernard Hosley, John Haydock, and Robert Slotsky, who would later become known as the Texas Rangers. These academics from different backgrounds caused comprehensive revisions in the architectural design curriculum of the school through an inclusion of new visionary methodologies. In around 1953 and 56, while teaching at the University of Texas, Rowe and Slotsky wrote 2 essays titled Transparency, Literal and Phenomenal 1 and 2. The first one, rejected by the Architectural Review, was published later by Perspecta in 1963, while the second one, published after a long delay in 1971, again by Perspecta. As Collage was a manifestation of Rowe's Cornell studio teachings, the transparency essays could be seen also as manifestations of the Texas experience, or better to say, experiment. A more layered and dynamic understanding of context in the works of Colin Rowe could be traced in his Texas years. As shown explicitly in his transparency essays, the relationship between figure and field was layered and was open to different interpretations and readings, and therefore dynamic. Plan game invented during this period. In the plan game, participants drew architectural plans from different times and places to observe the possible combinations of archetypes without the limitations of reality and to ponder over the thresholds of unexpected encounters. The only known example of the plan game was published in the book Texas Rangers, Notes from an Architectural Underground, written by Alexander Karagone in 1995. There are possibly many other drawings produced in those years. However, the current whereabouts of the drawings are not known. The scanned version of this so far only known plan game can be found in the GTA archives, and it was exhibited at ETH Zurich in 2016 within the scope of the Drawing Cabinet exhibition. John Haydock, as one of the pioneering participants of the game, explained it as follows. During the intense heat, Colin, Bernhard, Bob, and I played the game. I think Colin and Bernhard invented it. We will take a large blank sheet of drawing paper and begin to draw plans of buildings, historic and otherwise. Colin would say, I'm going to draw the plan of Villa Madama, then Bernhard would draw the plan of Wright's Gatehouse, etc. All night long, in the early hours of the morning, the paper would be filled with plans from all times, many hybrids too. At the end, Colin would be devilishly amused and delighted. In retrospect, who would have thought those plans of classicism, neoclassicism, modern, constructivism, and contemporary would have been the genetic coding of the architectural monsters which followed? As it is described, the participants pin a piece of blank drawing paper on the wall and start to draw architectural plans and urban elements. In this drawing process, the participants can observe and spatially modify the drawings of others when it is their turn in order to improve the spatial qualities on a larger scale. In this way, they consciously decide which fragments are to be integrated into the drawing and design the rest of the imaginary city accordingly by increasing the spatial continuity. Now I want to give the floor to Cansu, who decomposed and analyzed the only remaining copy of the plan game as part of her graduate thesis work. Cansu?
In this part, we try to interpret and decompose the only surviving copy of the plan game by comparing its architectural plans with the plans of historical buildings and ancient city plans. Some archetypes in the drawing can be found in the Nolli map and the Roman form plan. The drawing primarily consists of architectural plans from ancient Roman and ancient Greek periods. It also includes some special references from the Baroque, Hellenistic, and modern periods. Among the structures in the drawing, there are prominent archetypes like Baroque church, public terrace, five-nave church, Megaron plan, double-ended temple, and so on. Most of the plans are included in the drawing by reinterpreting the original version of the typology and adding some new spatial features to establish a better relationship with the surrounding spaces. There are also some special combination of more than one building plan. For instance, you can see the example of this interpretation in the number 9 and 10. By this way, plan game brings together many architectural and urban elements to achieve an imaginary city plan. The components of the drawing demonstrate that plan game not only includes buildings, but also considers the design of the urban environment. The landscape elements of the hard and soft ground are differentiated by using diverse hatchings. Specific attention is paid to the relation between the semi-closed and open spaces. And some urban elements are integrated to the drawing, like the obelisk, to define the outdoor space more precisely. And plan game was later included as an in-class exercise in the curriculum of various architecture schools. This creative recombination technique was used as a pedagogical tool to urge the students to deal with the urban fabric as a whole, both its architectural components and the urban elements, to increase their awareness on knowledge on the use of architectural precedents in the design process, and to support their experience of collective urban design. In our research, we find out 3 plan game assignments given by different instructors in various design studios. The City of Composite Presence, you can see at the top left, is produced by the 2 graduate students at Cornell University. And Bernard Tosley's assignment given at ETH Zurich, and Mark Morris' assignment at Cornell University, called as Exquisite Conurbation. The traces of plan game can be found at Cornell University in the drawing called City of Composite Presence, produced by Han Kohlhoff and David Griffin in 1976. They used architecture precedents rather than archetypes and paid special attention to preserving the public space's continuity. And for instance, you can see the special relation between Piazza dell'Anfiteatro in Lucca and Strada Nuova in Genoa. The gates of the piazza and the street of the Strada Nuova are positioned to allow the continuity in the public space, or you may observe some formal references between the Narentrum and Villa Madame. And next, please. These drawings were produced within the scope of Bernard Tosley's assignment at ETH Zurich in the 1983 and 84 academic period, found at GTA archives. Compared to plan game, almost all students' projects include a limited number of closed space. Instead, they preferred integrating semi-closed and open public spaces into the compositions. Therefore, it is hard to identify the architectural precedents and archetypes and the relation between the interior and outdoor exterior spaces in the urban fabric. Next, please. And the last plan game assignment is Exquisite Conurbation. Mark Morris, who is a visiting professor at Cornell University, also integrates the plan game into the curriculum of architecture as a 1-semester project in 2012. A total of 50 drawings were produced within the scope of this exercise. Some of them connecting the architectural plans only by streets, as in the second at the bottom left, and some of them having dense urban fabric. But more or less, many of them pay specific attention to the relation between the architectural and urban spaces. And all in all, plan game is a crucial exercise encouraging participants to design architectural and urban spaces together by blurring the disciplinary boundaries of architecture, urban design, and planning. This fictitious exercise calls for a collective design and brings together a collage of architecture precedents beyond time and place. In order not to blind admirer, it is significant to note that the inadequate aspects of the game as well as its potentials. This exercise does not provide three-dimensional information about the urban forms and the architectural components of fictitious city plan. It also presents a bias section that primarily includes architecture precedents from the ancient Roman and ancient Greek periods. Despite these shortcomings, when compared to the figure ground diagrams, plan game strongly emphasized typological and spatial qualities and continuities in the making of the city. While the figure ground diagram aims to represent the built environment with its footprints, plan game focus on the spatial features of architectural works by showing the interior organization of architectural precedents to improve the relation between architectural and urban spaces. Therefore, compared to the figure ground maps produced by Rowe students at Cornell Urban Design Studio that analyze urban fabric, a more layered approach was already referred in the Rowe's previous works like the plan game. And thank you. This is all from us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Esin and Cansu and Cansu. I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing it very correctly. I would like now to go ahead by inviting Barbara Littenberg and Stephen Peterson to do their presentation. Briefly introducing Barbara Littenberg and Stephen Peterson are practicing architects. Sorry? Are practicing architects, urban designers, and educators, authors of the 2019 book Space and Anti-Space, The Fabric of Place, City and Architecture. As partners in Peterson, Littenberg, Architecture and Urban Design, New York City, their practice explored the relationship between architecture and cities through competitions and teaching. They did more than 20 urban designs and master plans. Barbara taught architecture at Princeton University, Columbia University, and as an associate professor at Yale University Graduate School of Architecture for 14 years, directing the graduate urban housing studio. Stephen Peterson taught urban design and architecture at Cornell University, Columbia University, and the Notre Dame graduate program in Rome, Italy, as well as in Syracuse University graduate program in Italy again. He was director of the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies in New York. Please, Barbara, the floor is yours.
Hi, we're trying to find our presentation.
Here.
That's not ours.
Okay. Sorry.
Slide this down.
We're trying to figure out how to screen share. I can't figure out how to do it.
There's a green button you push.
Screen share. Yes, it's green.
There it is.
Okay, let's try that.
It'll count down. Yep.
You see it now?
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Excellent.
Okay, we'll begin. Today we wanted to focus on the issue of urban fabric and its relationship to collage and contextualism, started with Colin Rowe. As a summary, I wanted to say that collage and contextualism are the two methodologies most associated with Colin Rowe's work on urban design. They are the essential design concepts that connect individual works of architecture into the blocks of a city's larger urban fabric. They are essential to maintaining urbanism. Collage in urban design is the technique of juxtaposing different works of architecture together into other existing urban elements in partial new compositions. Contextualism in architecture is the technique of designing buildings that are both discrete unto themselves and also help to form the larger patterns of a city's urban fabric. Thus, urban fabric is a city's extended pattern of blocks, streets, and spaces. This is the common denominator of all urban form historically, but has been discarded in the contemporary city's rapid growth that prioritizes individual tower developments. This loss of urban fabric eliminates the city's capacity to define urban space or to shape the public realm. Following on this talk, it addresses these issues by describing the components of the urban fabric and how its restoration was essential to our World Trade Center design proposal.
Okay.
Oh, next.
Okay. This is showing now the two conditions of urban fabric as it's represented in the aerial photo and the view of Lower Manhattan versus the Pudong district in Shanghai. These two plan or aerial pieces are juxtaposed partly by the shape of the existing topography of the site.
They're at the same scale.
And they're drawn here at the same scale. On the left, Lower Manhattan with the East River and the Hudson River on the right. Here's Pudong with its contemporary development, the new development on that piece of land that was abutting the traditional city of Shanghai. Here again, you could see the development in Lower Manhattan via the towers and Broadway and Bowling Green, and then the visual 3D development of the Pudong. Now, again, to show the kind of urban fabric conditions of these two diagrams here, deliberately drawn not in a black and white conventional figure ground way. This examines 117 acres comparing Tyson's Corner, Virginia, Lower Manhattan with its block and street pattern, and the Pudong area of Shanghai. Ironically, the Shanghai and Tyson's Corner, if you just look at the plan image and forget about the 3D manifestation, look remarkably similar as spatial constructs. Here again, showing urban fabric, and let's shift back to that for the moment. Urban fabric being the essential quality of successful urbanism. We here show a variety of the spaces, what can happen, and the flexibility and interpretive qualities of different urban fabrics, and how the fabric itself conveys information about the actual organization and spatial arrangement of each city. The three cities which are spatial urban fabric cities, Rome, Paris, and Manhattan, aerial view, you can see how the plan, the blue stuff, is depicted in Rome, how it works in the aerial view of Paris, where you have major slices through the fabric, establishing larger urban connections, and the repetitive aspect of the gridiron of Manhattan, where public space is fundamentally established or made by the elimination of portions of the grid, as opposed to the carving and shaping of the public space. Phoenix gets into problem. Obviously, all three, ironically, Paris, Rome, and Manhattan represent 33% of that little piece of map is represented by open urban space. Phoenix, the aerial view, it shifts over to 60% open space, and clearly the urban condition is dissolved. Talk about the urban fabric.
Oh, you.
Okay, let's look a little bit more closely about the urban fabric. The spatial network diagram of Lower Manhattan at left shows the kind of street pattern, the graining that led from the East River on the right, which was the sort of port area in the original development of Manhattan. The west side was cold and relatively undeveloped at the early days. you could see that, I guess the point here really is that the urban fabric is the kind of unchangeable. If you compare Lower Manhattan in 1867 to Lower Manhattan in 2018, what one finds is the urban fabric has remained constant throughout that time. And what has transformed are the particular architectural elements that have then plugged themselves into that urban arrangement. We developed, based on that, something we call the molecule of urban fabric. And what it does in this series of things, it tries to analyze the urban block as the primary component of a successful urban condition. The fabric at the top represents the interactive, the forms of solid and void. Urban architecture at the bottom represents the architecture of a particular block in Lower Manhattan, that one could see how the block is then made up of commingled architectural elements that are touching each other and composed together to form that urban element. To go through these, the urban fabric is composed of a network of space, which is linked continuously, compared to its opposite, the figure ground alternative, the matrix of blocks, which is the solid material, which is arrayed in patterns. Spatial elements, the volume defining public space, the urban blocks, which are the buildings that define the urban solids, and then the common membrane, which is a sort of interesting essential piece, which is that layer, the facade, which forms both the bounding edge of the urban block as well as the defining edge of the urban space. So the membrane, the street wall and block surface is the critical linking element. Now, out of that, the architecture, to the left, you look at wall buildings, which can be embedded in the blocks and produce the individual works of architecture, and the tower buildings, which then get themselves entangled in the block, where the base operates as the unifying element that joins it to the other constituent parts, architectural pieces. Here again, looking at that block, and this is an actual block in Lower Manhattan. The premise is the following, that urban architecture is fundamentally embedded and entangled in city form. Urban architecture is a composite form, part building, part city, and it coexists in two conditions relative to the larger urban form, which is embedded in the block, urban architecture, commingling to form the larger aggregate entity, and it's entangled in the block where the towers engage their own base to anchor them into the city. So these are the kind of building pieces. Now here's some examples of towers on fabric. The image of the Helmsley building at the south end of Park Avenue North closes the space of Park Avenue looking south. And then the images of commingled towers with cities coming from as old as Duccio's Temptation of Christ on the Mountain, the idea of the containing envelope and the architecture that gets embedded. And then the image of the sort of city of the future of 1939, showing how the towers are now erupting out of the lower level contextual pieces. And there's a kind of curious juxtaposition of those two things. And how am I doing time? A comparison of different space types. This is just a comparison of the Hudson Yards proposal that was done some years ago for Lower Manhattan. There was the whole development way over on the former Hudson Yards space. The site, I don't remember how many acres it is, but this was the official plan that was put forward, which was really just a series of towers that was standing around, arranged around a central, sort of a central green with other towers interspersed within it, culminating in a shopping center. This is what is actually built there or today with the existing buildings that are standing around, and counterposed with that, this would have been an urban fabric plan, which would allow the same definition, same amount of open spaces in both site plans. But here was a demonstration of how you could actually superimpose a little piece of Rockefeller Center, which is here, Grahame Park, and I don't remember. Tudor City. So those were 3 New York spaces to scale. They could have been replicated in some form and in fact extended the city in a very meaningful way based on its own typology. And here again, a 3-dimensional version of those spaces and how the arrangement of the mass could have been distributed in a way to actually make New City. Here is an attempt to put towers on top of that urban fabric to increase the density to match what was asked for on the site. This was the Trade Center proposal as we put in. We worked on this starting in 2002. We were brought in by the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation shortly after the site was cleared by the terrorist attack. And this is a little bit of the process we went through with the client group to show them what the site actually could contain. Since the Trade Center itself was always viewed as something out of scale and anomalous within the city, it was not particularly liked until it was destroyed. And then it seemed to have gathered many fans, but that's another story. First thing we did was we built a little model of the World Rockefeller Center complex, which was typically viewed, I think, by most New Yorkers. Everybody accepted that this somehow represented the epitome of New York urbanism of the kind of modern persuasion. You can see the tower of Rock Center that slits down there, and you get, essentially you could replicate the whole World Trade Center within this little package that's being inserted into the site. The proposal we did consisted of the notion of the base condition, that is the underlying 10-story urban fabric, that would then allow the continuation and extension of existing urban pattern suggested by the adjacencies and the requirements of the site. Existing condition plus the superimposition of a major new urban space that would operate at the scale of the city. So the scheme essentially was trying to both complete the existing local fabric while overlaying a new large public space that would be at the scale of the city.
A new twin tower.
And then of course there was the clamoring for the twin towers. So they became superimposed here as elements marking up in the sky so that the site could be identified from a great distance from the site itself. And the towers are placed, these buildings in the foreground are the existing Caesar Pelli World Financial Center. So these are placed so that they actually look through those existing towers so that they, from inside occupying the buildings, you would have views of the Hudson River. And there were a little bit of boosters on top here because people wanted 1,776 feet of height, although clearly nobody would like to occupy any space up there, but it was a little bit formed that marker. And this was a comparison of the winning scheme, which was Danny Liebeskin's proposal, and our final scheme. These were in competition with each other. In our case, the whole idea of the sequestered garden, which was a kind of a microcosm, it was based partly on the Palais Royal, which is a kind of, as a precedent, an interior space in Paris with controlled very few entries in it. Pedestrians would be allowed to penetrate through into the space, but traffic would be excluded from it. It funneled in the traffic from the streets Broadway and Church Street, which were coming down from, it's not Church, anyway, from the north and then continuing through the site. The footprints in this case were expressed through 2 different forms. One was an amphitheater for public events and the other as a pool of water. So you could see the position of the 2 existing towers. None of the new structure encroached on that supposed hollow ground. Add anything?
No.
Here's 2 of the towers that were then built on the site. Disconnected, isolated objects. Here's a little piece of Calatrava's wing that forms the entry to the Port Authority Transportation Hub. And in the foreground here, you can see the Libeskind Museum to the event. Anyway, it's a collection of objects. It is a non-spatial solution. And there you have it. And this was the proposal in its particularities. In this case, we took the scheme out from the center where the sort of analogous Palais Royal space, the amphitheater, brought it out to West Street, and actually diverted the traffic coming down West Street into a tunnel that would go under the site and hook up with the Battery Tunnel connecting to the east side, for those of you who know New York. And on top of that would be placed what we were calling a Champs-Élysées, which was a kind of boulevard, which is a place of remembrance, which is the Elysian Field, that in the end would be an extension of the memorial from the internal sequestered quiet garden space out into the public realm that would then produce a promenade down to the park at the base of the city and views out to the Statue of Liberty.
And all backed up by urban fabric.
And all the urban fabric that then gets created that extends the city into the site in this area and from the north into these building sites. Anything else? 10th floor gardens on the roof, the big towers as they were sitting there, the transportation hub, etc. And here's just a little ending thing showing city of towers built on urban fabric, past and future city, showing a view of San Gimignano juxtaposed with 59th Street in Manhattan from Central Park, that there's this connection between the idyllic landscape as it's introduced into the city, as well as the city of fabric, which is combined with the city of tower, that these things can coexist. I guess that's the big idea. And rather than having to choose one or the other, I think one can make an amalgam and show that they demonstrate that these things demonstrate the mutually reinforcing qualities of each of these conditions.
Good.
Okay.
Done.
Now,
Thank you. Thank you very much, Barbara and Stephen. Thank you for this very interesting presentation that brings us forward from theory to practice and from past to present, actually bridging them. So I would like now to go ahead introducing Blake Middleton, who will talk. I mean, the title of his talk has changed, is Evidence of an Argument. Blake Middleton is a founding partner of Handel Architects and the lead designer for some of the firm's most prominent work. His expertise lies within the field of hybrid mixed-use building as a catalyst for creating sustainable, revitalized neighborhoods in dense urban environments. His institutional and educational design work has been built in different cities, among others in Boston, New York, Santa Barbara, and his work has won distinctions from Urban Land Art Institute, the Congress for New Urbanism, etc. He is a recipient of the Rome Prize and Fellow of the American Academy in Rome, and has lectured widely and studied with Colin Rowe and at Cornell University. So please, Blake, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes, nods of heads. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be joining this wonderful group of designers. Let me see if I can share my screen and bring that up. You all see that image? Great, thank you. I'm going to turn myself off just to, because I don't like watching myself while I'm talking. Just give me 1 second to hide my video. Okay, great, terrific. I've changed the title of my talk. It was one thing about 24 hours ago, and then as usual, I have sort of rethought what I want to talk about. But the idea of evidence of an argument is sort of embedded in sort of a bigger issue, which is really that argument being that, which was multifaceted and layered with complexities, was postulated by Colin Rowe through most of his tenure running the urban design studio at Cornell. It can be reduced simply to this: how can the architect reconcile the contradictory forces between the traditional city of streets, city blocks, and public squares, and the modern city of freestanding building typologies set in open space? We've heard a lot about that already this morning. Many of Rowe's students went on to practice as professionals, often in urban environments for commercial or institutional clients, or even city planning agencies, and design building spaces or both that have had a significant and positive impact on renewing and revitalizing downtown settings. This morning, I want to trace 20 years of urban design and architectural interventions in Boston, Massachusetts, in a historic district that suffered from post-World War II depletion of investment and some of the egregious ravages of urban renewal. The variety of hybrid buildings developed for 4 sites in this area became catalysts for positive urban change, energizing both the public realm of the street and square along historic Washington Street, which is actually that orange line that you see in that aerial view of this downtown Boston. Shaped as composite buildings where the constituent parts of the building are derived from archetypal forms, these projects restored the continuity of the street realm. They are large enough to have a meaningful and sustainable economic impact while resolving contingent conditions around the site perimeter. They unabashedly embrace high-rise construction, which had to address street continuity while addressing the complex issue of contemporary towers in a historic city center of 8 to 12-story buildings. My presentation will conclude with our most recent project, Winthrop Center, which was, when it is completed, will be the largest pass-to-pass office building in the world. It is already a model for high-performance buildings leading to net zero carbon emissions without sacrificing the responsibility of embracing the fundamental principles of urban space and placemaking that Rowe inculcated in his students. Excuse me. Now, to move to the next slide. Here's the trick. How do I do that? This may be a problem. Let's see. There we go. The Rowe studio problems are often addressed cities impacted by the post-World War II modernist compulsion in the US to improve the downtown traditional city by raising multiple blocks in a neighborhood for either new housing or highways. So my thesis with Colin was not unusual in this type of research. So I'm going to quickly talk about this and then move into the meat of the matter. Providence, Rhode Island is a small city at the confluence of 2 rivers situated on the New England coast, which by the 1850s had both a defined civic center with a wonderful oval esplanade and a modest railroad station hugging its edge. So that's the center there. Oops. And this is really interesting. This is the sort of Center Cove Basin where the 2 rivers came together, and it's a wonderful space that was set there. But in this case, urban renewal took it took a kind of 19th century guys, and it was really the railroad and its compulsion to expand with a large elevated platform obliterated the esplanade and jammed the rivers into narrow canals and left the Capitol Hill district completely cut off from the city center grid. My work with Rowe looked at ways to reestablish that connection, repairing and binding the tissue of the city while accommodating an improved rail station, and discovering that the solution was not by increasing density, but redefining the open space with clearly distinct edges, streets, and parks. And so just because everybody loves sketches, it's a little intimidating. Steve Peterson is here, and these are sketches of his from about 35 years ago. That's part of a critique of my project. And then, of course, Colin would weigh in, and the element du jour back then in 1980 was, the Prato della Valle. So that was another inspiration as we started to look for solutions. And ultimately, all of this, and this is sort of the final scheme for this thesis, but all of this kind of lodged in my head and, became the backdrop for subsequent work. When I worked for James Stewart Polshek for about 15 years and left to join my partner, Gary Handel, in 1997. My first project was to design a building complex of almost 2 million square feet in downtown Boston. It was a scale I had not encountered before. I found myself drawing upon some of the lessons from 25 years before, and little did I imagine that the first project that I'm going to show you would be followed by 4 others that would dramatically reshape and revitalize this part of the city. So I'm going to go kind of quickly through this one. Hopefully the illustrations will speak for themselves. In this site plan, you can see the isthmus of the original Shawmut Peninsula of Boston, connected by this neck way down at the bottom edge of the image to the mainland. And then, of course, the expansion over the centuries along the waterfront edge. But Washington Street was the central spine of the city, linking the edge of Beacon Hill back out to the mainland. And the area that we're looking at was considered both the commercial and the entertainment district center of Boston. It was almost like taking Herald Square and Times Square and stretching it out and combining it together in terms of the activities there. Boston, of course, was not immune to urban renewal. This is, an aerial view of the city from around 1960, just after a whole bunch of clearance occurred in the Scully Square in the west end of the city. Parts of Washington Street were also affected by this intervention, and of course, the building of the major highway that sort of ran through the city. Boston also suffered, not unusual decline of the downtown portions of the city due to suburban flight after World War II, and a declination in the sort of the commercial intensity there. This is a picture of Filene's department store, which I'll talk about more in a second. On the left, the theater district sort of declined into what became known as the combat zone, the name of which speaks for itself. But by the 1980s, there were a number of proposals to look at rebuilding portions of the city center, invest into this portion of the city. What is interesting and also challenging was that these involved the super block, raising some of the texture of the earlier grid, closing down streets and expanding very large multi-block projects, one of which was built called Lafayette Place, which was a good 700 feet long. And so it was a huge project that you can see on the upper right here to try and revitalize through a mixed use project, mostly retail space and hotel functions along here. That also, they cleared some sites for an additional phase that you can see over on the right. That little sort of parking open area became a parking lot because it never got completed. Subsequently, there were further proposals by the end of the 1980s into the 1990 that looked at even larger proposals to invest and revitalize this part of the city. One of the problems, however, was they're so big, they were subject to the vagaries of the economic forces going on. And the recession in 1990-91 pretty much killed these projects. But the sites, in particular, the one on the right, were raised, buildings cleared, ready to build that project, and it did not go forward. One of the theses that we have about these kinds of buildings, it's really about the programmatic drivers that make these composite buildings and these large mixed-use structures actually work. And so I'm going to show very briefly the how this gets done, not the why. But this idea of mixed-use buildings, creating a sort of a hybrid of program uses, also drive a lot of intense use at different hours through the day. And if the mix is carefully kind of thought through and it can be marketed and sold, it has a profound impact on revitalizing the street activity and thus the success of the whole proposition. At the same time, it's sort of, in the back of our minds, we're, thinking about the sort of formal assembly of these kind of buildings, which are quite complex. And as Barbara had already mentioned earlier, the idea of these tower blocks, both embedded or entangled, certainly became a theme of what we were working towards. The typical buildings in this area were a monoculture, essentially, of office and retail, whether in the low scale from the early 1900s or even 80 years later. They essentially only had one type of primary use to them. And the difference that we discovered in bringing this first project to the city was that by combining a series of other functions, you can create more value both in the section of the building and capitalize on the possible return on investment, if you will, by the developer for buildings of large scale and mixed uses. And so I'm going to skip this one here. What happened well, I'm a little worried that we've lost some slides, so that is troubling. Okay. Well, I'm just going to keep rolling along. There was a subsequent project and we started in about 2010. There was a big recession in 2009, as we all know, and that left a large hole in this part of the city on the second project that we were doing, which was the Millennium Tower proposition. There was a previous scheme, which is one on the left called One Franklin, which had a great mix of uses, but it was heavily weighted towards office use. And our client came forward with a proposal to change that mix significantly and push the idea of residential development of significant scale, redo the Burnham building on the right, that sort of lower podium structure, and make that both office and retail use, and let that program begin to be the sort of foundation of the project. It's an interesting historic location. There's an interesting Charles Bulfinch project that was done in the late 18th century, which still had its sort of footprint as part of Franklin Street, which you can see on the upper left, this sort of curvilinear condition. And our tower proposition, you can see there at the corner of Washington and Franklin. It was all about, reestablishing that street scale while still intervening with a very large tower. These are studies of the sort of morphology of how to add to the historic Daniel Burnham building, which was sort of the light yellow on the left, and then the proposition that we ultimately developed, which was to allow that building to remain, to have it retain its clear identity while the tower also had its, but the two would be linked at about a 60 to 70 foot high scale at the base. This is showing, that idea of street continuity at the base of the tower. So there is a way to make these high-rise buildings work in these contexts. The shaping of the towers are driven by internal forces. There's lots to say on that, but I'm going to continue to move forward here. The location of the tower was interesting at this end of Boston Common, because it really began to dovetail into the financial district and became a kind of a new marker for that location at the city scale. This then is a map that shows, the additional developments that began to occur as a result of this project. Then these are some views. Can you see all that? There we go. Are you seeing the full slide? Yes, great. Photographs of the building in place. This is the Shoppers Square Park in the foreground. So this is a space that had been there, but had lost its definition, now reestablished with the base of the tower, Washington Street off on the right towards the earlier project that we did. This is an aerial view of that square, which is both pedestrian and cars moving through it. And the renovated historic landmark of the Burnham building allowed to retain its retrieve its earlier glory, connected at the hip, if you will, to the tower. Finally, the fourth project that I want to talk about is the Winthrop Square project, and that is on that right-hand circle there, which is really part of the financial district. So several blocks away from that tower that I just showed you is this site here. In the 1930s, Winthrop Square was essentially defined in a kind of irregular form, but it still had its definition. It was a major newspaper building fronting onto it. And then, of course, over time, other things began to happen. The city's response to properties that were going into receivership was to tear them down and build parking lots in them instead. So both here, which is a little hard to see where it says Winthrop Square, there's that kind of T-shaped parking lot. Two-story building was placed in that location between Federal Street on the right and Winthrop Square on the left. I didn't point it out, but there's even a square called Post Office Square where they also built a parking building to replace some buildings that have been there before. In around 2006, a developer put forward a proposal for a 1,000-foot tall tower in that location. It was a stunning, icon and a proposition for the city of Boston. However, the FAA decided to weigh in because Logan Airport is right across the harbor from this area, and it turned out that 1,000 feet was never going to happen, and only about 750 or to 800 feet would be allowed. That project then also died in the 2008 recession. Subsequently, the city went forward with a design competition for that site, which we were one of 6 entrants, and we put forward a proposal that you can see here in the center for a new mixed-use tower at that position, a combination of program elements that you can see on the left. The significant and distinguishing feature of this building, however, was the idea of this connector, this galleria that actually ran right through the center of the building, linking Winthrop Square to Federal Street. These are the competition images for that space, with a variety of commercial uses, office use, actually coming off of this space, and residential tower connected, flanking outside onto the square itself. This is a view from the Winthrop Square itself, looking back towards the entrance here. The notable feature in all of this, of course, was how to establish a plinth that would tie 2 400-foot tall towers to each other and reestablish the character of the square itself. This is a diagram showing those kind of linkages that would help gather both the pedestrian traffic through the building and towards it. How does one make that connection between sort of open space and the interior space, and the kind of scale of thinking that we had there? This was the initial proposal for the site plan of that major space that ran through the building center, and then the various lobbies that worked off of it to the north and to the south, and functions that began to support it on flanking on either side. But a clearly articulated and defined center galleria that ran right through the building and linked the square to Federal Street on the right. A diagram that actually shows the component parts, or the sort of composite character of the building, and the plinth that really began to reestablish that street wall on the plaza side. And let me slide that up a little. And that became a very important component to approval for this project by the city authorities. At the same time, on the opposite side, it was putting back a kind of a missing tooth in the street wall, a lower scale building, much taller scale building, and our tail, if you will, that also fronted onto Federal Street, mediated between those 2 different scales along there. That is an inherent sort of characteristic of this part of Boston, both along Washington Street, Federal Street, and other streets around this area, is this kind of syncopated quality of the street wall, but it is continuous for the most part, and it provides a very strong identity for Boston. I talked briefly earlier about the idea of this being the passive house building. These were the sustainable design objectives of the project. It does all to suggest that there's no reason that one can't make a high performance, low carbon emissions building or zero carbon emissions building without and not lose sort of fundamental characteristics of reestablishing the street, defining the public realm in a clear and organized way, using a composite building that would make those linkages occur. The site plan here, more in the figureground representation, showing those spatial links. This is a view of the connector from Federal Street, sectional perspective, showing how that linkage works through the base of the building, sort of grand portal gesture opening out to the plaza, and then the tower in the cityscape beyond. It is being built, so I had to throw in a picture of construction just to prove that this stuff is happening. What's interesting is then, as that project was happening, other projects now having been stimulated by a series of these large building projects being proposed, has dramatically altered the character and vitality of this district. This is a kind of our sort of way of representing the measure of success. The number of buildings that have been developed in this period over the last 20 years in orange, which are new construction, and green are renovations, and blue are proposed projects that are already happening. And I think that alone says a lot about what has happened in the sort of the positive characteristics of these buildings that begun to build on each other and reestablished sort of a vital urban corridor through this part of Boston. And just to summarize, the hybrid building manifests, a very interesting creative tension between the rationalist paradigm and a performance-driven program. The section is really a vertical economic ecology, the idea that there are multiple uses that have different values. And if you dispose those in the right way in the building section, you can actually make this building a strong economic driver, both as an investment for developers, but also as a place of work and habitation for those that live there. The residential hybrid building is also a social condenser, and it compounds the potential for street activity and positive urban change. And ultimately, an architect, I believe, really needs to harness that process, understand what the sort of drivers are, and that in turn begins to inform the shape and morphology of the building and how it in turn links itself back to the context, all of which was essentially a recapitulation of something that I learned, many years ago, and continue to find a strength in drawing on those fundamental lessons that the Rowe studio offered to us at the time that Colin was teaching there. And that is a very fast version of a much longer talk and missing some slides. So I apologize for some gaps in the continuity there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Blake, for giving us a further kind of exemplification of this link between theory and practice. So back to theory, therefore, and I would like to invite David Grahame, which who at the end of the story is the coordinator of this thematic node and of this seminar. So I would like briefly to present Grahame. He studied at the Architectural Association at Cornell University and has received his PhD in architectural and urban history with Professor Colin Rowe and Chris Otto. He taught at the AA in the 70s when director was Alvin Boyarsky, and at Bennington College before starting at Columbia University in the 1980s, where he continued since 1991 in the urban design program. He's the author of Recombinant Urbanism, Conceptual Modeling in Architecture, Urban Design, and City Theory. His notes towards the intellectual biography of Colin Rowe, 1938-78, will appear in the forthcoming The Urban Design Legacy of Colin Rowe, which will come up in 2022. So to a certain extent, Grahame will talk about this exactly biography, intellectual biography of Colin Rowe right now. So Grahame, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to start sharing the screen, I hope. Yes. Start broadcast. So can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Sorry. So thank you, Helene, for hosting this. I am talking more as a historian than a designer, and I'm really focusing on Colin. And again, like Blake and everyone, it's a very short part of a much bigger discussion that this forthcoming monograph will hopefully expand on. And what Blake has been, and everybody's been talking about, is the sort of hybrid and mixed ambiguity that's sort of central to Colin's thought, that's beyond the normal sort of bipolar of ancient and modern, classic and modern, that there is a context that creates a continuity, and that the hedgehog and the fox are both at work in the sort of Isaiah Berlin hypothesis argument, and that collage of classical and modern creates a new world that is leading to the beyond. And that's the sort of beyond the polarity is the basic thing. So for my purposes, I used also a 1956 collage from Guy Debord of The Naked City of Paris. It's a kind of fragmentation of elements of enclaves or small pieces of the city that are connected by, in the case of the situationist desire, but also could be armatures or streets that connect the city. And then there's this kind of wild white background that is yet to be discussed. But for my purposes, I want to talk about how Colin was in fact a kind of collage of all the different places that he studied and people that he met, and that he was a very dynamic and shifting intellectual biography. He began living in the country, but he started to study at Liverpool. He then went to London to the Warburg. He wrote for the AR, Architectural Review. He got a Fulbright, went to Yale, studied there, then went to Texas, spending a year driving across the country, the USA, and then ending up at Texas, staying there 4 years. In 1 year, he was at Cooper Union and Cornell, then back to England in Cambridge for another 3 or 4 years, then to Cornell again and founding the IAUS with Peter Eisenman, then at the Institute for International Design with Alvin Boyarsky, and then back to Cornell for the long term with breaks in Rome and then retirement in Washington. So this is kind of a wild ride, and doing it at speed the way I am is going to be even wilder than it might have to be, but I've got 15 minutes. So bear in mind that it is fast and furious. And I'm treating Colin as this sort of multiple collage. And so I made collages to represent its different phases. One thing that he is doing, if I can, is that he moves from the metropolis, the sort of ancient city, into the megalopolis with the car, and then the fragmented metropolis, of which Collage City is a very important text. And then now we're dealing with the megacity and meta city of information. And Colin's, in his dealing with the Roma Interrotta and this imaginary history that Esin was beginning to hint towards, of this collage ability of is part of that opening out. He was trained as a paratrooper in the war, and I think of him paratrooping into these different urban situations over time. He originally came from a mining town where there were huge Corbusian-style mining facilities of modernity, working class housing, a brand new grammar school which he attended for the bright, it was selective children, where he studied Latin and also German. And then this was this strange mixture of industrial city and agricultural territory with some very big industrial towns and many mining villages. So it's from this South Yorkshire that he goes to Liverpool. And in Liverpool, Abercrombie is the great town planner of the British New Town tradition. And he's in charge of replanning London after the war. And Rowe, when he's a student at the Warburg, which is where he will go next, actually works for Abercrombie. His brother told me that he worked for Abercrombie. And the Liverpool school had the only school of urban design in it. The head was Holford, who planned the City of London after the war. While Rowe was in Liverpool in this Georgian terrace and on a Georgian square, the Nazi bombers killed 40,000 people and demolished the docks, which were very important for the colonial empire trade along with the London docks. So, and then Rowe volunteered to be in the paratroopers. Abercrombie was part of the town and country planning that there should be this new hybrid with the new towns, and you all know the garden cities of tomorrow. And of course, there is the metropolis in the center, the green belts, and then the new towns around. And there were 17 new towns built around London as Rowe was a student at the Warburg. Rowe, as a student at Liverpool, he was 18 years old, developed a big reputation as reported by Bob Maxwell, a fellow student, and Sam Stevens, another fellow student, as a great advocate of Le Corbusier and modernity, very, very vocal. And then there's no schemes kept from that period, but Bob Maxwell describes how they made in third year a program of a street level, a cube of a department store, and then the Villa Savoy as a restaurant and garden on the roof. Rowe apparently made a Miesian facade all the way to the ground. This is Bob Maxwell's superior scheme, according to him. And they were all, after the war, Rowe he graduated, was injured in the war and graduated and became a teacher. And after the war, they all tried to work out how, this is Rowe, Sterling, Sam Stevens, and Bob Maxwell, this student group, how Corbusier was going to bring into Saint-Dié this modernist utopia. Meanwhile, Rowe became the only graduate student of Widkower, who was from the Warburg School in Hamburg, and with Saxel made, while Rowe was still a student, this amazing history book of the classical tradition coming into Britain and infecting the sort of Anglo-Saxon world from Italy. And Widkower couldn't visit Italy during the war and pre-war years, and had developed this whole diagrammatic technique of analyzing the Palladian villas, which Rowe applied to Corbusier, much to Widkower's annoyance. Widkower also wrote about Corbusier and about the picturesque landscape and townscape that was coming at that time, being very critical of it and emphasizing that the picturesque had a classical component, the picturesque landscape. And Rowe, coming from a landscape, town country, industrial background, was very aware of that. He also was very, very interested in Frances Yates, who did The Art of Memory, and he ignored her rather a lot, but was sorry afterwards. And then Gombrich became a great influence on him. So this was where Rowe sort of was coming out of. I skipped. He, as a student of Widkower, he went through Inigo Jones's drawings, including the plans for Covent Garden, which I became involved in analyzing as his student at Cornell. Anyway, after Liverpool, London, and the Warburg, he continued as a teacher at Liverpool with his students to try and analyze out Corb's very confusing drawings with two different schemes presented in the Œuvre Complète of 1946. And what they didn't realize was that there was a huge car park underneath the podium that Corb drew from an aerial perspective. And then he kept changing his mind about where the municipal building should be, whether it should block the old Main Street axis, of course, up on this podium, or whether it should be located to the side, blocking the view to the cathedral on the hill, which is what he showed here. So they have transparency here and blockage here, or either way, it could flip backwards and forwards. And then also, I was very interested in the scale dimension of what was being shown here. And this is from Bernard Hoseley, picking up on the transparency and blockage discussion at a later date. Okay, so this dimension, Rowe, landscape was very important to him. He was very, in 47 with CM6, Christopher Tannard came, and he was teaching at Yale. And one of his Rowe's motivations for going to Yale was the influence of Tannard and landscape and the new scale of the automobile, but also Tannard like Henry Russell Hitchcock, who also came to the conference and was in London in 1947. This had this similar emphasis on classicism and modernity. I'm just looking here quickly at Sterling's thesis, which took the program of Saint-Dié and put it into an English new town with the different neighborhood units and landscape. But it has a much more formal axis from the shopping center to the civic center with the tower on axis, and then this sort of entertainment district along the street facade, and a hotel and municipal offices, and sort of working the different axes. And then Sterling understood that there was an underground car park inside the Saint-Dié, and has an underground car park, which Bob Maxwell did these beautiful perspectives of. And then just to look at that, trying to find that schematic of the 9-square grid coming through from Vidkoa, and then when Rowe goes after his time in New Haven, where he thought that the painter I'm blocking out his name, never mind, that the layering of albas from the Bauhaus, which is the front plane, the red at the front, or is it at the back? And then how the layering works, setting up this perspective inside the layering. It was a very big eye-opener for him. He wrote that it was the best thing in his study there. And he went with Bob Slutsky to Texas, and this whole issue of transparency, layering, blocking buildings, and the side opening out to the landscape became a thematic in his work. But again, he didn't realize that underneath, as pointed out by Sebastian Marrow later, there was a huge car park podium underneath here, which we sort of looking at. And this is Hoseley reporting on the layering pedagogy, and then of course using Corb's purism rather than the guitar three-dimensional rotation and layering of Picasso. And then there's this essential gestalt of the ambiguity. Is it two faces or a candlestick? It's both at once is the important memory. So you have the layering, the gestalt that can work both ways, this ambiguity. Bernard Hoseley from Houston, Texas, makes a beautiful book which arrived in 1970, explaining all of this, but it's post-rationalization. By then, Rowe is already beginning Collage City writing when I first arrived. And then there's this memory of how do you remember this Gestalt figure and deconstruct it, and the rotation of the grids and so on, becoming into around this key central figure, becoming a big debate. And back in the day, this is looking at Rowe with his students, looking at Sandier, and then the scaling down to the League of Nations, that it was a more manageable scale, and the Witkowian diagrammatic analysis could come through. And yet at the same time, this ridiculous sort of modernity of the parking garage underneath this, and then the building floating 3 meters up, 15, 20 feet, out into the landscape, which Sebastian Moreau emphasized. And then this is comparing the parking garage Sandier to, And so when Rowe left Texas, he drove across the country for a year, and then that was before Texas. Then he ended up at Cornell and Cooper Union with Haydock at Cooper Union and Alvin Boyarsky as his student and he began a whole investigation of Camilla City. I'm not going to go, other people have spoken about this. It's really interesting to start looking at the scale of Sandier and then at the Camilla City, which it was interesting that Bob Maxwell, after studying with Rowe, went to the civic design and did his thesis about Camilla City in Liverpool. And then just looking at these are the Cornell 1966 scale drawings, starting to when Rowe got to Cornell with Wayne Cooper, reviving the work that he'd done with Alvin Boyarsky and looking at this whole transformation of, there is a giant scale in Camilla City's work, as well as and it's a very classical scale, as well as the micro scale. And so you're getting a multi-scalar reading of Camilla City that's coming through. And then Rowe left America for 4 years and had a fairly unpleasant and unhappy time in Cambridge. But he did meet Peter Eisenman. That was a very important meeting. He also had a number of very interesting and important students there, including the landscape professor Michael Spence, who was being very important later. And he had a student called Barry Maitland, who became an expert on mall history and the armature of the mall being 200 meters, 600 feet as a medieval and other urban element. And while he was there, he looked at Korb's the sort of breaking down of the three-dimensional grid of the Witkowian model out into the landscape in Korb, and then his student Eisenman took the three-dimensional grid into another whole dimension. Rowe and Eisenman founded the Institute for Architectural Urban Studies, and then during that time also Cornell produced its classic urban design work, which Michael Schwarting was talking about, the Harlem work. And then there's also the big scheme for MoMA shown in Buffalo, and then the Harlem scheme shown at MoMA. And for me, it was Tom Schumacher who wrote the Ideal and Definition article in Casabella in 1971, which was part of the Institute production. That was a very, very important article for explaining this earlier work as I arrived as a student from Archigram. And for me, the Alvin Boyarsky's summer school was a sort of transitional period for me, and Rowe described it as his dark period at Cornell. Brian Richards was a fellow student from Liverpool who came and was a traffic engineer. Brian and Colin drove across America together before Texas. Sam Stevens was the fellow student. Bob Maxwell was from Liverpool. Colin was from Liverpool. Warren Chalk and Peter Cook were a new generation of Smiths, and then Cedric Price was a Cambridge student who went on to the AA and was all about time in architecture, layering. And then, of course, Raina Bownham was, in a way, Rowe's nemesis and rival from the early AR days with Pevsner. And then there was Warren Chalk, and Sterling was there, and Alvin was the coordinator of the whole thing. So this was an amazing Hans Hollein and Hal Braken were from continental Europe. And this Rowe had a huge fight just before this with both Ungers and with Eisenman, resulting in him being sort of leaving the Institute, the IAUS, but he found a sort of new home across in London. And I worked on the Covent Garden scheme that was then being produced by the Greater London Council with the community groups. And Colin had me pin up all my drawings, and we would have these critiques in the Bartlett. And I found all these rivers going through. It was based on the Buffalo scheme, but a much more intimate knowledge of these fragments over a vast territory over 200 years on the west side of the City of London. And then without knowing that Colin had gone through all the Inigo Jones drawings, we re-entered into that discussion and found that there were these armatures that made a sort of mega block incorporating the stream beds and then these old urban fragments into a new kind of system. And just to wind up and end now, as I look back on all of this, I realized that Colin worked with landscape in Roma Interrotta. It's really interesting, and he talked about the city as a museum in the talk at ArtNet in 1975 in a conversation with Charles Jenks, and that the city is a species of museum. And it's really interesting that Sterling made a museum of his own buildings and projects on his site in Roma Interrotta, again, working at a quite intimate and smaller scale, whereas the Rowe team, with which Barbara and Stephen were very important members, worked at with the landscape scale across a huge territory, and then with a sort of village element and a grid element from New York grid colliding with the sort of landscape remnants of the Roman and other imaginary cities. And it was very important that Rowe wrote this meta-city, meta-history, imaginary history, including all sorts of unbuilt buildings onto the site with their own meta-history and ideal fragments. And what I became very fascinated was that I worked at a much smaller scale in terms of Covent Garden and the fragments. And I started to realize that when he worked, say, in Buffalo, he was working still like this is a mile-long street and about 400 feet wide with towers in the garden. And then this huge landscape project on facing the lake. Whereas the New York project that Michael showed earlier was still working with the grid at in some ways, a much smaller scale. And there is the New York City grid within the Roma Interrotta. So anyway, it just brings me back to that there is this sort of central ambiguity where the grid and the tower and the landscape are always being woven backwards and forwards in together. And I would argue that Ungers and Rem, they bounced off of Colin and that landscape into their city archipelago, very for Berlin project. Rowe, of course, did his own City Beautiful. And I would argue also that in trying to reconstruct New York with the Metropolitan Towers, looking out at the fabric of the city and so on, Rem also was bouncing off of Colin. And so this opens out into a whole other conversation. And also I would say that Sterling coming and building this community arts center at the gateway to to Cornell campus, that there's a fragment of both Ungers and Colin. In a way, Colin was very big factor in bringing Ungers to Cornell with Seligman and Kota. That there's a huge landscape element with the gorge going through beside the building. That there's a piece of Colin and Sterling in place there. For me, the history of the urban elements, the 5 urban elements that Colin added at the end of Collage City was very, very important. The armature of the street, the terraces and gardens overlooking the city, the different fragments and textures built over time, and then the coordinating buildings, which are complex and hybrid, that sort of work like the guitar by my modeling, make for this complex reading of the city. And so I sort of end with the multi-layered, multi-scalar sort of reading of the city over time, these different elements and the hybridity, and then looking at where Roma Interrotta was shown initially in Rome, and then the second time in Zaha, layered and collage building into this complex site. Of course, the ramping and so on inside is a whole other discussion, but it's a beautiful public space made in quite contextual in here. And then even the entry court where the building was, the Roma Interrotta was shown, as opposed to Hadrian's market, where it was inside this sort of shopping arcade that were linked from the Campus Martius to the cascading terraces of the forum. It's well, it's just beautiful the way in which it is all drawn together in the complex thought of Colin Rowe. So I'm going to stop there, and of course you can link this to rationalism, to new urbanism, to landscape urbanism, to the meta city of information Colin made up, this history that he put in place in Roma Interrotta. And so it opens out in 1,000 different ways. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grahame. Thank you for closing and opening a new debate that I'm sure you will organize in your next seminar. But now I would like to leave the floor with Rosemary Wakeman, who is the discussant, but before, and who will contribute, I mean, or coordinate the discussion after giving her kind of insights. But I would like to first present her. Rosemary Wakeman is an urban and town planning historian and professor of history at Fordham University, Fulbright Global Scholar in 2018-19, and senior fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study, Central European University. She's co-editor of Urban History Journal and in the editorial board of the Journals of Planning, Perspective and Built Heritage. And among her book publications, A Modern History of European Cities, 1815 to Present, and Practicing Utopia, an architectural history of New Town movement. Please, Rosemary, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Helena. So you can hear me, the audio is working? Yes, good. Thank you. So thank you for the invitation to participate in this seminar, which is a wonderful opportunity to learn more about Colin Rowe's work and his students. And thank you as well for all these wonderful presentations. So I thought I would just spend a few minutes on some reflections that will be really a bridge from Grahame's talk and really stays in the realm of theory. And I'm particularly interested here in Colin Rowe's idea about the historic city and the city as museum, and also the influence of Camillo Sitte. So that's where I'm going to go with some of this. And my purpose was to think about the complicated terrain of reading and deciphering the historic city and what it meant for Colin Rowe's work. So that's what I'm thinking about. And I thought it would be interesting to begin with Tony Bennett's well-known 1988 article on the exhibitionary complex. And Bennett argues that the 19th century, in particular, when Sitte worked, for example, brought together an ensemble of disciplines and techniques of display that developed through museums and panoramas and international exhibitions and art galleries and arcades. And together, these institutions classified and ordered objects for public inspection. So that's where I'm beginning with this. And it's in this context in which Camillo Sitte, who played such an influential role for Colin Rowe, became such an influential or well-known urban critic himself. And it is a moment when the appearance of the gigantic city, the world city, the Großstadt or the Grande Ville was coming into its own. And the urban world was expanding so rapidly and to such a degree that intellectuals and reformers like Sitte felt the need to communicate the past, communicate a sense of history as it was disappearing, and to think about the future of cities. There was a sense of urgency to this. And this is exactly the context or where I want to situate the work of Camillo Sitte and Otto Wagner as well, and their reactions to the transformation, for example, of Vienna and the Ringstraße, and the role that they play in Colin Rowe's oeuvre, his work, and also his creative thinking. Sitte, of course, argued for the historical experience of cities as the basis for their design. That's a simple way of saying it. Places should be embellished, and that word is important in the way he thought, by projecting past examples into the future. Otto Wagner, on the other hand, in looking at Vienna, argued for modernity as the framework for architecture and design. So this was the great narrative that took place as cities were transforming right before their eyes. In terms of Wagner, though, interestingly, nonetheless, the city as museum, an exhibit of the past, the history book that Grahame just mentioned, influenced Wagner's understanding of the future, even as he saw modernity as the direction to move forward. Wagner's design, for example, for the Kaiser Franz Joseph Stadtmuseum on Karlsplatz in Vienna occupied him, the museum occupied him the longest and the most intensively, even though it was never built. He was devoted to the museum's presentation of the past. And so in this play of temporality, Wagner's Dream Museum was dedicated to the present as well as to the future. And he spent the early part of his career designing a utopian museum city called Artebus that worked as his utopia of the future. So this is exactly where I want to situate Colin Rowe's historic contextuality within this tradition. In other words, the museum was not only the historical or material expression of a specific ideological tradition or worldview, its role, according to urban intellectuals, from Camillo Sitte to Colin Rowe, was to transform and give rise to new concepts and new ways of understanding urban life. So this visual perception of historic contextualization, the city as museum, or an exhibition of the past, has been a pervasive strain in architecture and urbanism since the onslaught of modernity. Urban critic Lewis Mumford, for example, saw the museum as the most typical institution of the metropolis. One of the principal functions, Mumford said, of the city itself was to serve as a museum. It is a palimpsest, a multi-layered record, sort of an object of accretion that bears the traces of its earlier form. So as I think and as I listen to your presentations today about Rowe and Cotter's theories, I want to think about them from this point of view. In Collage City, they describe perspectives on the 19th century city, and Grahame has already used this term, as a species of museum, a habitable exhibition, an historical panorama, taking the very vocabulary from the 19th century. Biedermeier Munich was the supreme example, but so was Rome. So the city as museum, the scaffold for exhibition, as Collage City says, is open, hospitable. It has a multiple of object references. And following Freud, Rowe imagined Rome as almost a diagram of the unconscious, a map of memory. Even the decision to hold the unconventional Roma Interrotta exhibition in the archaeological space of Hadrian's Market suggests much about the city as it was interrogated as exhibitionary space. It adhered to the architect's desire to retrieve historical and collective memory and to play with it as architectural language. So reading the solids and voids, the interrelation between them, the figure-ground relations echoing Camillo Sitte were central to the vocabulary of urban meaning. This was the landscape of convention for Rowe and his colleagues and his students. For Rowe, the infilling, completing, or subtracting from the traditional urban fabric and from historical ideals and utopian imagery, juxtaposing them, revealing their subjectivities, creating composites and hybrids and collages. This was the bricolage that would basically put a spike in the rational modernism of the 1960s and 1970s. So it brings us to the birth of the postmodern or the post-rational, and I'd love to hear more about that as an architectural vocabulary and the ways in which the city becomes a memory board and how contextualism, according to Rowe, absorbs this. In the exhibitionary complex, Bennett argues, echoing Foucault, that classifying and ordering and reordering is a form of discipline and power. Surveying the city, using its maps or through maps, its solids and voids, its objets trouvés, and then reconfiguring them as collage is itself a technology of architectural power. And it creates the city as panorama and spectacle. It's an important question, I think, in particular, to honor Colin Rowe and his work, but to avoid hagiography. So I want to know more about his ideology, more about the background of his politics that was already mentioned by Esin. I'm also interested in the idea of the city as spectacle and historical spectacle, and where Colin Rowe's work might fit in to the 21st century absorption with the city as spectacle, and also the city as urban heritage and the urban heritage industry and where that brings us. So in terms of possible other questions, what ideals or utopian archetypes that are retrieved from history actually function as gateways to the future? And what do they tell us about the ideological subtext of the movements towards the post-rational that Colin's work played such an important role in? Perceiving the city as a field of play and intervening or interweaving historical chronicle with fictionalized narratives was part of a larger phenomena of the late 1960s. And that's an important platform on which I think to think about Colin's creative work. Asking why the impulses of the Baroque Rome of Nole became a platform for this creative play and for the idea of a new Rome is important also to understanding Rowe's significance. Why Renaissance classicism or the Baroque, which both of them, after all, are mannered aristocratic forms. It's an odd choice, for a rebellion against modernism. And there's an ideological economy in this. And it would help to understand this larger history of the post-rational if we figure on that a bit. Especially, I loved the images which show Rowe and his colleagues as the architectural underground, right? And why they would move towards the classicism in order to portray that. It's an interesting idea. What role did the radical art of the 1950s and 1960s play in Rowe's understanding of architecture and urban design? I noticed that Grahame put in some material, some imagery there of Picasso's guitars. And I think that there's interesting relations here between avant-garde art and architecture in the 60s and 70s. And finally, what does the plan game, and when does the plan game become a fictionalized version of built form and topography that uses the past as an abstracted field, but not much more, once again, than a classified and ordered set of objects and episodes for exhibition? So I think I'll stop there. There's more in terms of thinking about utopia, but I hope this gives us some basic ideas for questions and more of yours. I'm sure you have some excellent questions to begin our discussion with. And I believe that my task here is to direct some of the questions that Susanna has collected. But let me see if Susanna, can you let us know where you stand on that?
We haven't received any questions yet in the chat.
Okay.
Please, everyone, feel free to write questions or raise your hands, and we will call on you.
We'll wait a moment for everyone to reflect.
I just while people are thinking, Rosemary, thank you so much. It's really when we're all used to saying postmodern, but we're not so used to saying post-rational, and that's quite a jump. And we clearly live in post-rational times, put it mildly. And when I talk about meta-city, I'm thinking of that also, that it's hybrid and mixed and with all the difficulties that makes. And I also thank you for, can you say more about the Tony Bennett article and the link to Foucault, but also about hybridity, which was a big theme in terms of tower and block and so on, in terms of some of the presentations. And I'll zone out again.
Yeah, well, perhaps you're not familiar with this, but you should. It's a short article that's very available on the web. So it's Tony Bennett's very, very famous 1988 exhibitionary complex in which he looks at the construction of a series of institutions in the 19th century that essentially create the opportunity for collecting, classifying, and ordering objects, right? That then becomes interpreted by architects and designers and by urban reformers over the course of the 19th century. So that I'm looking for the origins of this idea of the city as museum, right? And making the relationship, the parallel between the arrival of these institutions in the 19th century and the idea, I just lost my earbud, and the idea itself of the city as museum. Because my effort here is to situate Colin Rowe's work within that tradition, within that long tradition, and how he manipulates it and creates with it. So that's my purpose. So Tony Bennett's article is very available, and I suggest you read it. And he uses Foucault's idea of discipline and power in the construction of 19th century institutions, along with the hospital and the prison, as a way to get at these ideas, right? So that's it. Hybridity, I'm not sure, Grahame, what I can add to that. I'm hoping that other people will as well, rather than looking at me specifically. I would love to hear what all of you might think about this idea of hybridity and what it has to do with Rowe's notion of collage, as a matter of fact, and the way he institutes a wide variety of objects from the past, as well as from his own creative ideas in looking at this.
I have a comment about that, if I may. This is Stephen Peterson. I think our emphasis on the urban fabric, or that part of the city which is a traditional spatial density of blocks and spaces on the ground, is the essential medium for the idea of city as museum. And the city as spectacle destroys that. The city of Chinese cities expanding all over the place, and public housing and modernist terms is a destruction of the city's fabric, which means that the city and museum can no longer exist. It's being usurped by the individual towers standing around in the park. Blake Middleton's office clearly does the opposite in Boston, wedding the tower objects back into the fabric of the city at the ground level and making multiple use functions occur. But I think the crisis of our time is, it's important to recognize that the city, in a sense, this aspect of culture, broad, deep, historical, cultural references that the city in its best form takes, is being eroded and destroyed completely. And our focus in our talk was to try and analyze what it takes to make this occur again and to sustain it.
Thank you very much. And interestingly, I think the urban heritage industry also functions ironically as a way to destroy the historic fabric as well. So that would be an interesting